Hello again, this is Grant Swartzwelder, and welcome to another episode of Oilfield Strong. We got a fantastic presentation for you today talking about plugging and abandonment. It sure seems like there's a lot more A going on than P going on, if you get what I mean, as far as abandonment versus plugging. And we have a guest today that is living it every day because he owns a ranch, does a lot of ranching out in West Texas, so he sees firsthand the consequences of the plugging and abandonment issues that might be, or not might be, but are affecting the oil and gas industry. And think about some numbers. In 2024, end of the year, there was close to 10,000 wells that were abandoned that needed being plugged. Those are ones that there's no ownership on, and I said abandoned, but actually orphaned. But then you also look at 150,000 wells in Texas alone that are non-producing. Of that number, 103,000 are listed as inactive, meaning no production and most likely no upside. So, and then you break it down even further, those that have been inactive over 15 years, so no activity for 15 years, that's close to 23,000. So you can see that the number of wells that are abandoned, orphaned, however you want to define it, are going to just continue and most likely increase. During this episode, we're going to hear firsthand of what one rancher is experiencing and then talk about some of the consequences of what's going on within the plugging world. Uh, my guest today, Schuler Wight, is a long-term rancher. Your great-grandfather came down to Odessa with some sheep, kind of hung out at what ultimately became his ranch. Now you ranch and run cattle on what, 3, 4 different ranches, and and have been seeing firsthand kind of what's going on within the abandoned well area as far as from a ranch standpoint.
Yeah, that's correct. My family has lived the full cycle of the oil and gas business. When my great granddad came out in the 1800s, there wasn't any oil and gas, so we were there when they discovered oil under the ground, and then we were involved in leasing, then in drilling, producing, um, on down to the stripper well phase, to the plugging and abandonment, the orphan well phase of the industry. We've seen it all. Seen the full life cycle of the oil and gas industry. And I like to tell people that my family's been there 140 years, and hopefully we'll be there when the oil and gas is pumped out from under the ground. And when that day comes, we'd like to have some clean water and a clean environment in order to keep operating, because obviously it's part of our heritage, but it's also good for the people that live around there. You know, you got to keep in mind that people depend on ranchers to take care of the environment, because obviously we own the land, but that land is important because it furnishes clean water and air and an environment for people to live in. So
I've kind of heard it said that the rancher is really the first environmentalist.
yeah, we're the original environmentalists. That's the way I like to put it.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense because you got to live on the land, and if the land isn't clean and good, it kind of makes it hard to make a living on it.
Yep, it has to be productive. We have to always be conscious of how we take care of it and how we steward that land. If we don't take care of it, it's not going to take care of us. I like
So,
I like to tell everybody that, there's no sacred cows on my ranch. We always look at it really tough and hard, and if there's improvements that need to be made, we like to make improvements. We like to take care of things. We don't let would try not to let things get out of hand, because if they do, it'll come back to bite you in the long run.
so give us an idea where you ranch, where you run your cattle. What do you see from a oil and gas production, inactive well? Kind of give us a layout of what you're seeing out there.
So I ranch in 6 counties out there in the Permian Basin, and it's a challenge ranching in the most prolific oil and gas basin in the world. You know, the Permian Basin produces more oil and gas than anywhere in the world, and it's a challenge ranching in the middle of that. But we do it, and we accept the fact that we've got oil and gas operations on the land. But there's everything from pipelines to wind to solar to sand. We have sand mines on some of the ranches. There's water, there's SWDs, there's horizontal drilling, completions, there's old legacy production, there's water floods, CO2, and all the way down to orphan and abandoned wells. I mean, we literally see the full cycle of the oil and gas industry every day, day in and day out.
So within the area, and you can pick one of those ranches that you run cattle or all. How many wells? How many inactive wells? How many plugged wells? I know you've had some issues with some of the wells that are plugged, kind of becoming unplugged. Uh, Talk about that and what you're seeing, what
So
your experience is.
one of the ranches that I have has at present time has about 240 orphan wells on it. And at any one point in time, about a dozen of those wells will be flowing to surface. The
And what
ground,
is it flowing? It's brine water, brackish water, I
it's
assume.
oil, gas, and produced
Okay,
water
the
flowing to
whole.
surface. Some of them are just a little seep. Some of them will break loose and flow a river of water. It's it's pretty. It's really tough for me to watch that, being a rancher and being a conservationist. That it really breaks my heart to see that, because we work so hard to take care of that, and then the regulator fails us and lets this happen, and then now we have to deal with it.
So before we get to the regulator, talk about the consequences of that. The If it is seeping oil or water, gas, what effect does that have on the land, on the animals? You know,
The biggest effect is the groundwater. The groundwater contamination is really frightening, because once you contaminate an aquifer, it's almost impossible to clean it up.
uh,
It's pretty much there forever.
and it seems like the challenge with that is that's happening underneath the ground. So you don't really know what's happening, but if it's seeping up above, you're assuming that it's hitting the groundwater.
Yeah, that's correct. Of the 240 or so orphan wells on that ranch, nearly all of them would be a high priority for the Railroad Commission to plug, because they have pressure at surface. The Railroad Commission has a scoring system to score those wells, and nearly all of those wells would qualify as top priority to plug.
Has a scoring system on their priority to plug.
Yeah.
Okay. And do you have an idea of what that scoring system is? What's that based on?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that go into that. One is proximity to the groundwater. If the groundwater's 30 feet or less from surface. Another one is in a sensitive area. Some of the wells are in the Pecos River, which is obviously a sensitive area because it's a river channel.
Yeah.
If the well has pressure at surface, it gets more points. If a well is over, I think it's over 25 years old, it gets more points. Anyway, there's a whole system that they use to score those wells, and they come up with a number, and pretty much all of those wells would hit the high number as a high priority to plug.
You might not be able to answer this, but all these orphaned or abandoned wells, have they scored all of those, or do they just score them as you or someone calls them?
I don't, I don't think they've taken the time to score them. Can't really get into the
Okay. So
fact.
they have a scoring system, but whether we'll need to find out whether they've pre-scored a lot and kind of have a priority list or what. We're not.
Yeah, I wouldn't really have any knowledge of that,
Okay.
because that's
No, that's
kind of
fair.
back in the bowels of the Railroad
Right.
Commission.
Yeah. So this is now this is orphaned wells that haven't been plugged is primarily. Have you seen wells that have been plugged and have kind of come back to life?
I have in Winkler County. We have a ranch up there in Winkler County, and we dug up two wells on that ranch just for the heck of it, and two out of two were flowing to surface, and they were wells that were plugged by an oil company back in the 1970s.
But if they're plugged, they should be capped. How do you know they're flowing to the surface?
Well, if they're plugged, capped is the wrong term. They need to go to the bottom and isolate all the
Sure,
formations.
but how do you know that? By just digging them up?
Well, if you dig them up and there's fluid flowing out at surface, then
Okay.
obviously it's come unplugged.
Okay. That's what I was getting to is that, because normally you put a cap on there, obviously you plug down below, but if you see fluid, where's that coming from? It's either coming
Yeah.
from the casing or
from the formation down below. It's coming from
Somehow it's
somewhere
coming
down
from the
below.
annulus or coming from
Right.
okay.
That's correct. And I've seen it on neighbors too. I've got a neighbor at Horsehead Crossing that's got 2 wells that are flowing on him.
And so what's been uh, the approach on trying to resolve that?
Well, the approach is, originally it was to call the Railroad Commission, and they'd kinda ignore it and sweep it under the rug, but it seems like I get better results when I go to the media. When there's media attention that really embarrasses them, they get right out and plug the things.
But do you go to the railroad commission or do you go to the oil company that initially had that, or you
Well, if it's an orphan well, you can't go to the company
sure,
because the
because
company's
it's orphan.
obviously
Yeah.
bankrupt. And I wanna make another point about these orphan wells. They didn't just show up one day. Uh, these orphan wells that I've got on this ranch were drilled by a who's who of the oil field: Sinclair, Mobil, Sun Oil Company, Kerr McGee, a lot of
Yep.
those old names that you would recognize.
I'm old enough, I actually
The
recognize it. Thank you for pointing that
older
out.
people would recognize those names, but those companies are still around.
Yeah.
They've been bought
Well,
up
that or
and acquired.
they're purchased
They've
that
been acquired by other
right.
companies. Those companies drilled those wells, and I don't fault the operator for orphaning the wells. Uh, the operator, he's just out there, a guy trying to make a living and operate some wells and make a living, feed his family. I don't. It's the whole system that created those orphan wells in the first place that let ExxonMobil, Sinclair, Arco, all those companies sell those wells without having the liability and having the funds in place to plug them when they eventually become non-productive.
We have seen out in the market where larger companies sell their lower producing marginal type wells to the smaller company. Now,
Yeah,
in theory, that's so that those smaller companies they have lower G&A, lower overhead, can operate more cheaply, and so they're able to stretch that production out.
yeah.
So, but
There's nothing wrong with that, but there needs to be, at the end of life on those assets, there needs to be a pot of money there to plug that well, because that guy that's out there stretching those assets out, he doesn't have the capital to set aside to do that. And
do you have a sense of what type of pot of money is out there now, and ideas what it should be?
well, my idea is what it should be and what's out there now are wildly different. The bonding levels of the railroad commission are a joke. Some of these bonds are only $250 per well. Well, crap, you can't even buy the diesel to put in the
Mm.
pulling unit for that. So,
Give an idea to plug a well and just pick a depth, 3,000 foot or whatever, so that the listener has an idea of what the cost of that to do a good plugging job would be.
yeah, I think the railroad commission cost estimates, as far as I know, they vary widely across the state. I think they can range anywhere from $6 a foot to $75 a foot.
That's a wide range.
Yeah, $75 a foot in the Permian Basin, where the rig time costs more and the costs are a lot higher, and $6 a foot in some of the easier.
So a 3,000 foot, which in some areas would be kind of a San Andreas type formation, which a lot of that production out there, that would be a minimum of, if I can do my math right, 18,000 minimum on up to significantly more than that.
I think it'd be more like 200,000.
Really?
Yeah,
So it's like I said, if I could do my math right, but
it's
it's quite a bit of money on that. So
yeah.
and so do you have a sense as to what those are? Because if I know in New Mexico they're really trying to get the operator to put a significant amount of money, but if you ask for too much money,
Then you bankrupt the
then so you're self fulfilling your issue.
that's correct. I can tell you what the railroad commission has spent on the wells on my ranch. They plugged about 10 of them last year. They, I think, one this year, and their average cost has been well over $100,000 per well
For about what depth? Do you know?
for about a 1,800-foot well.
So pretty shallow. Wow.
Yeah, some of them. There's one well on the ranch that they spent 945,000 on
For a 2,000 foot well?
for a 2,000-foot well. There's a well on my neighbors that they just got off of. They spent 2 months on that well, and I'll bet you they spent over $1 million on one well.
Now, it's been a long time since I've done engineering, but what would cause something that would be to $150,000 plug job to grow to 900,000?
The
Especially
problem.
at 2,000 feet, because you don't have a lot of pressure.
Yep.
I don't get that.
There's no pressure, but the problem is they get on them and they can't get to bottom. There's junk in the hole that, as the engineers say that are in the plugging world, rust never sleeps. So over time, these wells rust and deteriorate so much that you can't get to bottom to
Now is
plug
that the
them.
casing, or have someone left
It's
tubing and packers and
casing,
stuff in the
tubing, packers,
rods?
rods, all that junk. It just rusts, and when they go to pull it out, it's just little pieces that
So
they
it's
have to go
so it's
fishing
the
and
fishing jobs that take so much and
fishing,
all the time,
milling, drilling out, all that. It takes time.
and you have to get that out to do a true plugging job.
That's correct.
Explain that to me.
You have to go to bottom. The Railroad Commission has rules. You're supposed to isolate all the formations. You plug above the bottom perforations. You use 14.8 pound cement, and you set the plugs at between each formation. But here's another.
And then in between the plugs, you're supposed to
Put mud laden fluid.
which is like 9.5 pound, something
Yeah,
like that?
9 pound mud, 9.5 pound mud,
Okay.
something like that. I'm not
Yeah,
an
we're
engineer,
we're
but
close enough.
anyway, one of the dirty little secrets about plugging these wells is that the Railroad Commission doesn't even follow their own rules. There's
Alright, I'm intrigued. Help me
yeah,
out here.
there's a number of wells on the ranch that they only plug the top 500, 700 feet of the well on an 1,800-foot well.
And the reason for that?
They said, "We're out of money. We just gotta put a plug in the top and drive off and leave it."
So but by doing that, it should prevent fluid from coming to the surface
But it doesn't prevent fluid from cross flowing down below.
in the groundwater areas.
Yep.
But now your casing and your cement around the casing, will that not prevent it from cross flowing?
Well, you got to keep in mind if you've got a well bore that's deteriorated so badly that you can't get down, then that well bore, there's no protection in that well bore. It's just a hole in the ground.
Yeah. And I think the point there, to tie it to the earlier point where we're saying, over 15 years, there's 23,000 wells. Time is not an advocate for,
Time is not your friend on these
because of why?
because they rust.
Because you've got water in there, it's sitting there and eating away, and the
Yep.
cement
That
and the
produced
pipe.
water is very corrosive and it eats up the cement, the casing, the tubing. It eats all it up, and you just got junk in there, and it's impossible to go in and get to bottom. Another thing the Railroad Commission doesn't do, they don't tag their plugs. They'll come in and set 3 plugs in the space of 2 or 3 hours and just
All right. For my viewers, what tag their plugs? So you're sitting a plug at a certain location, you
yep.
think you are. Tagging does what?
Tagging, after you set a plug, you pull out, you wait 4 hours on the cement to set,
Okay.
and then you go back with your tubing and you hit that plug and make sure it's there.
And by doing that, you've measured the amount of pipe, so you know exactly where it is.
You know
So
exactly
when you
where it
say
is.
tagging a plug, you know exactly where that plug is.
That's
And why
correct.
is that important?
That's important because sometimes those plugs will fall and sometimes they don't set. Sometimes the cement's just gone. So if you don't tag that plug, you don't know if it's still there.
Okay. And the idea is that you're putting a plug, and you said this a little bit ago, you're putting it below and above your water zones.
Right.
Is that
That's correct.
okay?
The idea is to prevent cross flow between the formations, but also to protect the freshwater zones.
Okay.
That well that I mentioned that they spent 945,000 on, they only plugged the top 700 feet of it. The Rustler Formation is 800 to 900 feet in that area. They didn't even plug below the base of the usable quality water. So it's just a real incompetence on the part of the agency that's responsible for plugging these wells.
So I want to talk about Railroad Commission and your experience there, but first, let's close the loop on the kind of some of the potential issues you talked about underground. What about on the surface side? What's the issue that you find with these wells that are flowing from that are either orphaned or plugged and not plugged anymore?
Yeah, when they flow to surface, obviously the salt water runs out on the surface. And back in the old days, before they used to inject the salt water back in the ground, they'd separate the oil and the salt water and just run the produced water out on the ground. They don't do that anymore. But there's a lot of country out here in the Permian Basin that's been so polluted by running that salt water on the ground that 100 years later, there's nothing growing on it
And why is that? What's
because the salt sterilizes the soil.
okay?
There's nothing that'll grow after you put a heavy load of salt
Yeah.
on it.
When we
There's
do phase ones, which are kind of an environmental check for an acquisition, a lot of times we'll use a Google map and you can see if there's some type of a shape of dead vegetation or no vegetation.
yeah,
Then from that, you kind of assume that has been some type of a spill or a leak or something because it sterilizes that, it kills it.
that's correct. Yeah, the Texon scar, you can go look it up online. It's on Google Maps. There's a lot of information on that online. The Santa Rita number one that was drilled on the university lands when they completed that well back in 1921. When that well went to water and out, they separated the water and they ran it down a draw. And today that draw is there's nothing growing on it, and you can
And,
still see it.
and how long ago was that?
They drilled it in 1921, so it's
So over
been
a
a,
100 years.
been 100 years.
Wow, that's well, and then you also have the issue of gas escaping and whether it's methane and greenhouse gas type issues, or
Yeah,
what we're seeing is a lot of H2S out there these days also, and obviously that's a deadly gas that can affect.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
correct. Beamer Lake, we haven't talked about Beamer Lake, which is across the road from one of the ranches. Beamer Lake has 14,000 parts TDS coming out of the well. You stand around that thing long enough, and you'll fall over dead. So
and is that you said from the lake, but is that coming from?
that's
Uh,
coming from the wellbore that feeds the lake.
oh, okay. So it's become a lake as you call it because of the fluids and the material coming from a abandoned or
Yeah,
a non-plugged well.
unplugged well.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the Railroad Commission. I know you've got a few opinions on those, and
I do.
you've been down there. Did I read that you've been down to like I don't know how many? Tell me how many Railroad Commission meetings have you been to?
I've been to nearly all of them for about 3 years now.
Okay, so you like driving down to Austin?
I don't like driving to Austin. I don't like Austin at all.
Okay, but you think it's worth
One
going down?
eh,
So tell me what you.
one thing about ranchers, we like to live like mushrooms. We like to hide out in a dark space and stay hidden from people.
There you
So
go. Well, Austin's not a good place to stay hidden from people. So it's so what? Give me your thoughts on Railroad Commission and you know they've plugged a couple thousand wells last year. You know they've got I think they just got $100 million to for over the next 2 years to go plug additional wells. So it looks like they're getting resources to plug wells. What's wrong with that?
there's nothing wrong with that. My only concern is that the legislature is not getting aggressive enough in addressing this problem. The let's go back to this abandoned well thing. The cheapest day to plug a well is the day that it quits producing, right?
Fair enough.
If you wait if you wait years, you can wait one day too long, and that well can go from being a $50,000 plug job to a $500,000 plug job. Because if that casing parts, if you have an earthquake, that casing parts, or if you have a cave in, or if you have a tubing get stuck, and the cost just goes up dramatically.
And all that
So
to kind of push back a little, and I know you're using examples of earthquake and cave in, but the likely scenario is it just sitting there in
the
that brine
rust,
water and the rust, and that's probably the most. Would that be fair?
that's the most
So it
insidious
takes
thing.
longer, but it still has a very, you know, that's going to happen.
Yep. You
Okay.
can wait one day too long, and that well will go from being a easy peasy job to something that'll
And
cost
and
a lot
then
of
oil
money,
companies will push back and say, "Well, maybe that zone has stopped producing, but maybe an upper
maybe an
zone,"
upper zone.
and that's always the justification for not plugging.
Right, right.
Is that
But the statistics tell a different story. I think fewer than 3% of those wells that are abandoned are ever re-entered for future production.
really?
So, yes, it's a very small percentage of those wells are
But I guess, again, tie back that if within a certain period of time, if it's too fragile to plug, it's also probably too fragile to recomplete.
that's correct.
So either way you go, at some point, it gets where it becomes more of a liability or less of a value.
That's correct. But if you take the wells that have potential that are just abandoned and take those out of the equation, just talk about orphan wells. Today, it's going to be cheaper for the state to plug those 9,700 orphan wells than it will be 6 months from now. Correct?
You would think?
If it's going to be more cost effective and a better use of the taxpayers' money to go ahead and bite the bullet and spend the money, let's get aggressive about it, plug these wells before they become a bigger liability. We we're passing on a one hell of a big liability to our kids and grandkids, and that's not right.
Yep. Well, we seem to be doing that on national debt and a few other things, but that's a whole nother podcast, Scott.
Yeah, we don't
So
have time for that.
it's so what I know you've had railroad commission people on your ranch working to plug. How what are ways, either what's been your experience, but also more importantly, what are things that we could do or they could do to make things better?
I think the number one thing that needs to happen in order for reform to happen and for us to get ahead of this problem and many other problems is we need to get the pay up at the Railroad Commission. The
Because
because you think about it, the guy out there in the field that's making $60,000 a year, the same skill set that that guy has out there working for the Railroad Commission, he could go to private industry and earn a six-figure income. The the Railroad Commission is just a way station for the industry. They're training these people and they're going to industry and making more money. We need to ensure that those people working for the commission are top shelf help. We need top shelf geologists, engineers. We need field personnel that know what they're doing, that have the experience, that have the education, that can go toe to toe with the industry and regulate this industry like it needs to be regulated. The oil and gas industry is the most important industry in the state. We need to have people working to regulate that industry that are top shelf help.
bring that all the way to the final point. Why do they need to be top shelf? What that having more experienced railroad commission folks does what for you?
Well, it for one thing, it ensures that the contractors that are working for them are doing their job correctly. It makes sure that when they're out there inspecting in the field and that they're overseeing things that they like their job, they like showing up for their job, they like, and they're gonna.
And I assume they have experience, so they actually understand what 9.5 pounds of mud means versus something else.
Yeah, I'm not trying to be too critical on the people that are working for the Railroad Commission. They do an admirable job, but they're understaffed. They don't have enough personnel to take care of all that they've got to take care of. They can't witness all their H5 tests. They can't witness all these plugging jobs. They can't witness all these setting surface casing,
And
all of that.
and I assume they're supposed to be witnessing it. And if
Yeah,
so, then who's witnessing it if they're not doing it?
nobody is.
So whoever's doing the test just does it and then sends it in.
Sends it in, and
Okay.
there's no verification. Uh, you don't know if they're doing it correctly or not. And but that's an understaffing problem. So basically, the commission needs they need better help. They need more people. They need more resources to do what what we've given them to do and what we depend on them to do.
You know, so you got the people issue, but then, one thing when we looked and did a little white paper on plugging, it was the W3 form hadn't been updated in close to 50 years,
Yes.
and that's the document that is used to kind of formalize the plugging.
Right.
So there's different operational issues where, like you say, tagging the plug, doing a bond log, doing a wellbore diagram. So there's other things that could, technology's improved in the last 50 years. I don't know
Right.
if you know that,
Yeah.
Skylar. So it's so how can we use that updated technology to help this plugging issue? And I know you've got some that's to plug a well, but then also it could be to potentially use these well bores in a different way.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, if the well bores were good, you could use them for geothermal or some other purpose. I've heard some ideas about using well bores for energy storage, and there's some good ideas out there, but you're not going to be able to capitalize on those ideas if we just keep going down this path of sloughing these wells off to operators that can't take care of them.
Yeah.
We've
And
got to
they
stop
go
that.
long enough, then it just becomes lack of value. This might be out of your beyond your fairway, but you hear about how people are able to plug wells and get carbon credits.
Yes.
Have you been approached? Have you seen that out there, or what's?
I've actually worked with a couple of companies that do that, and so far we haven't found any wells that emit enough methane to qualify and generate enough money to plug them
To justify them
to
buying or
justify.
investing or however that works.
Yeah, I think, just my opinion, I think that the carbon market is a great thing. It's private money that people are spending on carbon credits, and I don't see anything wrong with that. But the problem is, I think that's going to solve a very small percentage of the orphan wells.
Well, and again, this is beyond my fairway, but it seems like there's still a lot of uncertainty on uh, how do you determine the volume, the rate, and how do you do the math to see that you're how much carbon you're recovering or plugging
Yeah,
to be able to
yeah.
calculate that.
There's a whole formula for calculating that. They figure out how much it's emitting, and then they plug that into a formula and try to figure out a decline curve on that reservoir and all of that. And, at the end of the day, they spit out a number and say, okay, this is how many, if you plug this well today, this is how many carbon offsets, how many tons of carbon you're going to take out of the atmosphere. And I'm not smart enough to know how they do that, but the bottom line is I've had two companies look at that on the ranch, and they haven't found any wells that would qualify for that. So
Okay, because that's always been described as kind of a potential magic solution, but
yeah,
from a practice from your standpoint, it,
as a
it hasn't been.
as a practical matter, I think that's going to be a small percentage of the
Okay.
wells.
Yeah, one of the other factors you mentioned, the larger company passing on to a smaller company, is the whole idea of tracking ownership and responsible parties and keeping up with that. Because ultimately, if Arco or Sinclair owned a well and then it got bought a couple of times and merged into larger, then that's a responsibility of that resulting company, I believe.
It is in Texas, but when you go on federal land, it's the opposite. If you drill a well on federal land, then guess what? When it comes time to plug that well, the feds come back and say, okay, everybody that participated in this well, y'all get to figure out who gets to pay for it and get it plugged. We don't care.
So it's the dreaded circular firing squad where everybody
Right.
points at someone else.
Right. Everybody that had an ownership in that well gets to participate in plugging on it. And what's funny to me is that when you talk about that at the legislature, they say, "Oh, we can't do that in Texas because nobody will ever drill here." Well, the same companies that are drilling in New Mexico are drilling here in Texas. And in New Mexico, if you had a if you made money off that well, guess what? You get to go plug it.
Yeah. Well, I think it'd be an interesting comparison between New Mexico and their rules for plugging and sharing of ownership and the requirements versus Texas. very significantly different, and the number of abandoned wells that New Mexico has is uh, much smaller as
Yes,
a percent and in absolute terms. So
right.
it's had an effect one way or the other. Now, whether it's hurt the industry and hurt the general revenue probably depends who you talk to as to whether that's been the case or not.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no perfect way to do it, but I think that would be a good step in the right direction to require everybody that had any ownership in that wellbore to have to go back and spend the money to plug it.
So what have I missed on all this? What, whether it's potential solutions, you've mentioned upgrading the railroad commission from a compensation and numbers. What are other solutions or possibilities that we should be considering?
Yeah, I want to say one more thing about compensation at the Railroad Commission. You have to keep in mind they're a state paid, they're a state agency, and they have to go by state guidelines and all that. And I've heard several ideas about how to improve the pay structure at the Railroad Commission. And one that I've heard that sounds promising is to have an industry funded endowment, kind of similar to how endowments work for the endowed chair of embryonic studies at the University of wherever. You have a private funded endowment that goes to supplement that professor's income so that you can hire the professor that has the expertise and the brains to oversee that department. Well, something kind of similar along that lines, if the industry funded an endowment, a blind endowment that went to fund pay increases at the Railroad Commission, that could go. That's one solution. I'm not saying that's the best one, but that might be one way to solve this problem. Because again, oil and gas is the most important industry here in Texas. It pretty much funds
Drives the
it.
economy
it
to, well, and in New Mexico, I think it provides 50% of their revenue. So it's all these states, that are oil bearing.
yeah,
It's a big player.
yeah. We should not shortchange the regulators and the people overseeing this. We need to really think long and hard about how we compensate them, and let's compensate them relative to what they produce. Let's compensate them fairly. Uh, another another thing I want to talk about is we need a George Mitchell for well plugging. We've got a whale of a problem, and you think everybody in the industry knows who George Mitchell is. He revolutionized drilling and completion, and he found oil and gas
And,
where
and just for everyone, he's basically the father of Barnett Shell, learned how to horizontally drill and frack and shell wells, and that kind of created that revolution.
yeah, yeah, he figured it out just through dogged persistence. Think about this. We still plug wells the same way we did 50, 70 years ago. We take a 100,000 pound plus pulling unit. We take a truckload of pipe. We have a cement pump truck. We have a cement truck. We have a water truck. We have a frac tank. We have all this heavy stuff, and it's very expensive to operate all this stuff. You have a four-man crew that you have to pay them by the hour. There's got to be efficiencies in that process that can that can help that out. So let me give you a scenario. Let's say that each abandoned well, each abandoned and or orphan well in the state has a pot of money attached to it. Pick a number out of there, say 150,000. If there's a guy sitting out there that says, "Hey, you know what? I think with my method, I could shave enough off of that. I could plug that well for $100,000." Let him keep that 150,000 and let him get out there and beat his head against the wall and figure out a way, like George Mitchell did, to figure out a way to do it cheaper and faster and save us some money on this. There needs to be we need to figure out how to turn these orphan wells from liabilities into an asset.
Or at least reduce the liability and make them a more complete plugging. Especially when you have great universities Texas Tech, Texas A&M, University of Texas, that are very focused on oil and gas. It seems like there would be research to create better plugging means.
Absolutely.
And I'm not aware of any. I know under the Biden administration, they had a lot of MERP money,
Yeah.
and I don't think there were any real funds. I could be mistaken too, but it was all focused on green and kind of evolving that, and not really any research money for plugging,
Yeah.
which I found kind of interesting. That it seems like, again, if you haven't updated the W3 in 50 years, you probably haven't updated your procedures in
Right.
quite a
We
long
haven't
time.
updated the procedures either. But think about it this, give an economic incentive to a guy like George Mitchell that will go out there and say, "Hey, I can do this cheaper." Let them pocket the money, give them an economic incentive to do that, and they'll figure out how to do it cheaper.
Hmm.
And
I think that's called capitalism.
exactly.
How about that? I still know that word, so
Yeah.
it's well, good. Well, Skylar White, what a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate you coming in and sharing your thoughts and really giving a firsthand accounting of what you see on the ground. Because I think we hear a lot in the news, we hear a lot in uh, uh, just kind of from a distance, but hearing someone that is actually living and breathing it, I think really, hopefully, will help the viewers really understand what's going on and be able to kind of really touch it a little bit more. Obviously, I'm a very pro oil and gas. I'm involved in the industry, but we also have a license to operate, one that should require the industry, the regulators to do the right thing. And if you look at some of these wells and how they're not being plugged correctly or just not being plugged, it really flies in the face of doing things in the right way. And so I do this from a sense of being supportive of the industry and trying to do the right thing because ultimately that will help us from a PR standpoint, from a capital standpoint, and then just allow us to sleep well at night. So appreciate your time thinking about this subject, listening to Oilfield Strong, and hopefully see you at the next episode. Thank you.